This week on Inside the Issues, I talk with Gordon Smith on the death of Osama bin Laden. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, the CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And every week I talk to a noted expert in global governance here from the studios at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario. And this week I'm pleased to welcome Gordon Smith, a CIGI Distinguished Fellow, as well as the Executive Director of the Center for Global Studies at the University of Victoria, and in previous life, of course, a distinguished public servant, a Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador to NATO, and Canada's G7, G8 Sherpa for Prime Minister Chrétien. So
that's right.
Great deal of experience in and outside of government to draw upon today as we reflect on the very intriguing recent news about the targeted hit, I suppose we should say, of Osama bin Laden and what that means for the region, for the world, and for Canada as well. Yeah. So if it's all right with you, we'll start right off, and let me ask you the obvious question. Just how big news is this, the death of Osama bin Laden? Is this as big as the world is making it out to be at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's really big news. It's big news because it hadn't been done before. I mean, this is 10 years later. So I think it's big news, the fact that he is gone. Does this mean that Al-Qaeda will disappear? No, I don't think so at all. Indeed, I think there could well be heightened Al-Qaeda activity over the next few months. But the fact, because it's a franchised organization, as we all know, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, these are quasi-independent organizations. But Osama bin Laden has been the big name, and he has had almost a cult following, I would say, and he's gone, buried at sea.
But a lot of people had thought that he was dead already. There have been many reports of his death, and he's had long periods of silence where people thought perhaps he was ill, or he had died, or been killed or something, and we weren't quite sure. So it's a bit surprising to think that now that we're highly confident that we found him and he was killed, that it makes some kind of big difference. Is it more than an emotional difference, more than an optics difference?
I think it is an emotional difference, but probably on both sides. One, after all this effort and the ongoing war in Afghanistan and the activities of the U.S. and the Pakistanis in Pakistan, this was all designed to get at the source of Al-Qaeda. And the founder is Osama bin Laden. Now, once he's gone, as I said a moment ago, it doesn't mean the problem has gone away, not at all. But that leader, the spiritual leader, if I can call it that, for Al-Qaeda is gone, and I think that's important. I think it's going to aggravate his followers, probably prompt them to do something somewhere, or at least try. But I think that it's progress. It's moving in the right direction. That combined with, of course, all else that's happening in the Middle East and North Africa.
Now, there are a couple of thought-provoking aspects of the actual operation itself. One is the fact that the United States could insert Special Forces troops directly into the compound, kill him, get away with his body, and not suffer any casualties of their own. Really does testify to the capacity of the United States for targeted military action. And the other really thought-provoking thing is the fact that he was living in Pakistan, just a few blocks away from a major Pakistani military installation. Almost unbelievable that happened without the knowledge of the Pakistani government. What do you make of these competing, intriguing dimensions of this operation?
Well, I mean, who knows exactly what the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence service, knew and didn't know. But like you, I mean, he had been in this building for some years, it seems. The building was far larger than any building around it. There were a couple of people going in and out. I guess these were the couriers that eventually led the CIA to find him. But that nobody would have noticed that something was a little strange in that location is really defies belief. I think what that means is it's not going to do the U.S.-Pakistani relationship a whole lot of good. I think the United States now has been very careful to thank Pakistan for all the assistance it's provided. But one has to believe that within the U.S. administration, and probably for some period of time now, they've had a pretty good idea where Osama was, and they really have to wonder whether the Pakistanis are playing on the level with them or not. I think it's a clear indication, not for the first time, but they're not.
Now, we do have some fairly clear idea that there's sympathy for Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda in at least some parts of the Pakistani military.
Absolutely.
And of course, the real fear was that there would be enough of a connection there at some point that al-Qaeda might obtain nuclear material from Pakistan, or even, God forbid, a functioning nuclear device.
Yeah. And there still are, I mean, by latest counts, 100 al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and more in Pakistan. Osama's death doesn't solve that problem. The Pakistanis have been very clear they don't want the U.S. operating inside Pakistan. They are, and this was not a drone, as you say. These were helicopters that went in, and it seems they used that sort of flash explosive to stun everybody, and they went in and did what they had to do. But it really raises questions as to what the longer term developments are going to be in Pakistan. And really, there are major questions there.
So it's a lightning fast operation, a quick extraction of a body. They take enough material from the body to do a quick DNA test, and then they dispose of it at sea. What do you make of that? What's the signal communicated there?
The signal communicated there is that thank God he's dead, because can you imagine, I read somebody suggesting this earlier today, that he had been captured and that he have a trial. I mean, I can imagine nothing that would be worse. I think this is the best of all possible outcomes. It's hard to say this, but to be killed and then buried at sea in accordance with the Islamic prescription is absolutely the best way to have done it.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll be back in a minute to talk further with Gordon Smith about the implications of the death of Osama bin Laden. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Let's talk a bit about the implications now of the death of Osama bin Laden. And I'd like to start locally with the implications for Pakistan. So as you mentioned earlier, this is at one level highly embarrassing for the government of Pakistan, because it just shows how clearly that the United States can operate with impunity in its borders. And in fact, one former Pakistani Prime Minister, Nawaz Sharif, has already been stated that it's a violation of Pakistani sovereignty that's intolerable. What does this pose a challenge to the governance of Pakistan itself?
Already a pretty challenged government, I would say. It was interesting the way the Pakistani government phrased their statement. It was not critical, but nor was it congratulatory, their statement about what happened to Osama bin Laden. It would seem to me that the relationship with the United States will remain a very complicated one as long as the U.S. wants to use drones to have people on the ground in Pakistan. But I think that more broadly what we may find happens is that now with Osama's death, the war in Afghanistan, I think, is going to appear to people to be less relevant, obvious, and I suspect this will lead to disengagement. President Karzai gave an almost incomprehensible statement this morning. A very, very strange statement, which I'm not, again, the purpose not being clear, because every once in a while he does speak about how nice it would be if all foreign troops were out of Afghanistan, although one wonders how long he would survive in those circumstances politically, maybe otherwise. So I mean, I think it's hard to forecast, but I would see this as accelerating the process of disengagement from Afghanistan.
And there has already been some chatter in the United States about how this has undercut the rationale for being in Afghanistan, which after all was all about crushing al-Qaeda in the first place.
That's right.
Although, as you noted, probably al-Qaeda is not crushable. At some point, somebody else will rise up and take the place of Osama bin Laden as the chief figurehead.
But still may not have quite the same cachet as Osama. I mean, we will remember forever in our lives what this man looked like. I will remember forever his statement that your world will never be the same again to the West. And it isn't. I think of that as I go through airlines, go through airports to check onto flights, and take off my shoes and take out my computer and forget the change in my pocket. And he has done that. He's created a lot of jobs, admittedly, but he has. We will never think the same, I think, about security again. So his effect has been absolutely a major one. I think he's created the situation that he tried to create, that he wanted, and that is one of conflict. I use that word loosely, between the Western world and Islam. But it will be very hard for another figure to replace him with anything like the same sort of iconic character.
Now, there was some commentary already about al-Qaeda's stock having started to slide in the Middle East and globally, but also, most importantly, in the Middle East, partly because of the rise of a counter-narrative. For the longest time, he had the only anti-Western, anti-authoritarian government narrative, and now we have the Arab Spring, we have uprisings in Egypt, in Libya, and so forth, all around the area. So there seems to be an alternative narrative, an alternative vision of change in the region that may have begun to sort of destroy the attraction of al-Qaeda in the first place.
I think that's right. And I think that vision of change, as I read it, is a very positive, enthusiastic one. These are people searching for dignity and searching for freedom. Now, I think getting there is going to prove to be a lot more complicated. Libya, obviously, in the middle of a war. Egypt, by no means over. The military have yet to concede real power to a civil government, but there hasn't been an election, and there are supposed to be presidential and parliamentary elections before the end of the year. We'll see how that works. In other countries like Syria, very hard now to see what the outcome is going to be. So one has to feel sympathetic to these people who are looking for ways in which they can express their freedom. But as I say, it's just complicated to imagine how democratic systems are going to be involved, are going to evolve in the various countries. Now, coming back to al-Qaeda, of course, al-Qaeda is a very real factor in the Arabian Peninsula, above all in the Yemen, and the Yemen is a huge mess. It's not at all clear how Saleh, the leader, is going to go and when he is going to go, but al-Qaeda is already well established in the Yemen, and this surely will give them a better opportunity to strengthen their base.
And Canada's stake primarily in the region has been in Afghanistan. How does this affect the Taliban?
Well, I don't know that it does much to the Taliban. I think it's going to raise the question as to why it is, again, that we're really in Afghanistan. I would argue that we went to Afghanistan because of the United States. That's really why we went. We don't like to say that, but it's true. But it was because the United States wanted to engage with al-Qaeda. I'm not sure that with al-Qaeda gone, I'm sorry, a very important distinction, Osama bin Laden gone, the same degree of commitment to Afghanistan is going to remain. I mean, the war is not going well. Karzai's government is not making much progress. I really see people starting in Canada and elsewhere starting to distance themselves from Afghanistan as a consequence of these developments over the last few weeks. So Osama's death plus the Arab Spring.
Which may or may not be a good thing. We can talk about that in a moment when we come back. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Gordon, among your many areas of expertise is governance, and specifically global governance innovation. Now, the United Nations and NATO have been heavily involved in trying to manage all this upheaval in the region for a very long time, and it's through both the UN and NATO that Canada has been engaged in this. Does this signal a dramatically different changed environment from a global governance perspective? All of a sudden, do the problems change? Do the important actors change? Are there mainly threats here or mainly opportunities here? How do you see the global governance response to this development?
Well, I think that the changes that are taking place are quite remarkable. First of all, the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council authorized the actions that are taking place now in Libya. Yes, Russia and China abstained, so did India and Brazil. But the bottom line is they did authorize these actions. And that is to me, quite extraordinary. Also, something that hasn't been noticed, but China actually chaired the Security Council when that resolution went through. So I think that is a big change. It's interesting now that people are talking about the doctrine of responsibility to protect. Now, I'm not suggesting that that was in their mind when the decision was made to intervene in Libya, but it fits. I mean, I can't imagine a government worse than Gaddafi's in terms of taking on his own population. It may give life again, if I can put it that way, to the doctrine of responsibility to protect. As for NATO, it just leaves me shaking my head. I was ambassador to NATO when the Cold War ended, and one had never thought that would occur. But now, I never thought that NATO would, with a Canadian general no less, be waging war in Libya, going out, striking targets on the ground on a regular basis in Libya. I mean, it's just such a change in NATO. Where all this is going to lead, I don't know. I don't see anything comparable happening somewhere else in the Middle East, for example, Syria, for a whole variety of reasons. But it's an astonishing change with respect to NATO. Now, with respect to global governance and the work that we do here at CIGI on the role of summitry, we're doing meetings on the new geometry of summitry. What's interesting is that the French, who are chairing the G8, intend to have, not surprisingly, when the G8 meets in Deauville towards the end of May, intends to have a discussion on the Middle East. It's interesting that this will occur in the G8 and not the G20. I think that's simply because the G8 is coming next. But it seems to me that if one's looking at some sort of broader economic development plan for the Middle East, it might make more sense that that was being dealt with through the G20 than the G8. But I don't think anybody yet has really turned their minds to this question.
Is there a window of opportunity here for a regional governance arrangement to rise? The Arab League was playing an interestingly prominent role in response to Libya, but as far as we can tell, almost only in response to Libya.
I think that's correct. And I don't see yet the signs of some form of regional governance. There have been some people that have talked about a rise of pan-Arab nationalism, but I don't see much sign of that either. And of course, Gaddafi himself was trying to create the African Union into be something like the European Union, which of course was total nonsense and it didn't fly. So I don't really see a change taking place in regional governance, although the one thing I would note is that it is interesting that the Chinese sent a warship into the Mediterranean for the first time to help get their citizens out of Libya. So I don't know that this leads to governance, but it probably leads to different powers becoming engaged in the region in ways in which we hadn't thought about before.
Now, what about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict here? One of the few actors who stepped up immediately to say that the killing of Osama bin Laden was a bad thing was Hamas,
Yes.
who has just
Yes.
signed a concordat with the Palestinian Authority.
I'm very worried about that situation. I think that people will live to regret not having found a solution to the Palestinian state problem long before this. You're right about what Hamas said, of course. Also of note that a Pew poll of public opinion in the Middle East indicated that in Egypt there is a strong majority against the peace treaty with Israel. Now, that's not to suggest that the Egyptian military is about to renounce that peace treaty. I don't think they are. But I think it's going to toughen the position of the countries in the region and make it more difficult to get a peace agreement.
And does Canada have any role there, or are we bystanders in that particular issue?
We ought to have a role. Bystanders, perhaps, but I think what has become the case, and you may have discussed this with our colleague Paul Heinbecker on occasion, is that Canadian voting in the UN has become substantially more partisan to Israel. And I think we have lost some of the credentials that we had as someone who was really looking for a solution in an objective way. I don't use the word a bridge, but in an objective way. So I think we've lost some of that opportunity.
Unfortunate. Well, we'll be back again in a moment with Gordon Smith to talk about the implications of the death of Osama bin Laden. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Gordon, I always enjoy putting people on the spot to make predictions, to forecast the future. I realize that that's not technically our business because we're not in a predictive science, but nevertheless, if you cast your mind forward 1, 2, 3, 5 years, how might you imagine events unfolding in Libya, say in Syria, in Egypt? Start with those, and are we actually at the beginning of a new dawn as we had hoped a few months ago, or do you fear that the most likely outcome is some sort of backsliding and
I hope it's a dawn. We're certainly at the beginning, and I want to stress that. That I'm really sure of. This is Act 1, maybe Scene 2 of a 5-act play. So, get ready for more developments. I think in Libya, there's no solution that doesn't involve Gaddafi disappearing from the scene and his sons and maybe a group around them. But I don't see any sign at all that he's going to be prepared to do so voluntarily. One can draw one's own conclusions. We've been talking about the demise of Osama bin Laden, but it seems to me that the demise of Muammar Gaddafi and sons is sadly, I think it's sadly, when you're talking about somebody's death, has to be in the cards. The Libyans do not want, and this has been made very clear to me, the country divided in two. They don't want, and they will not in any event deal in any way with anything that involves Gaddafi staying on. So I don't know how soon that will take place. I don't think it's 5 years. I don't think it's 2. I don't even think it's 1. I think it's going to have to be faster than that because I think public opinion is going to get fed up. Egypt, that's really interesting. I mean, there are people who really are saying now nothing has really changed in Egypt. The military are still fully in control and they're not giving up control. I'm not sure about that. These are people, by the way, that are in the public intelligence business. But I'm not sure about that. I think what's happened in Egypt is irreversible. But I think it is entirely possible that there could again be great assemblies of people in Tahrir Square and more pushing and shoving before it resolves itself. Now, Syria, to me, is just the most extraordinary situation. And I think that we have to think about what it is like in life if you are told that you cannot, if you go into a particular square or plaza at night, everybody will be cleared out and live fire will be used, and people still go in.
It is remarkable.
It is remarkable. You've got to be very, very determined to do that. And I think these people are determined. And I don't see Bashar at all close to being prepared to give up. So I think Syria is going to get worse before it gets better. But my prediction would be that it won't work for him to kill, as his father did, 20,000 people. That the new social media, people with their camera, with their telephones that have video on them, that can upload video to YouTube. It's accessed through Twitter, through Facebook. It gets picked up by Al Jazeera and the BBC. It's things that happened in the past that people didn't, in the end, they forgot about, or they sort of pushed it to the back of their mind. I think it's much, much harder to do this when these images are in our face.
And there's nowhere really in the whole region that's without rumbling. We don't hear much about what's happening, say, in Kuwait or the Emirates. But there's nowhere where the people are entirely happy with their government.
I think that's right. I think Saudi Arabia is stable for quite a long while, I think, to come. But I read that a Salafist group was going to be marching into Amman, Jordan. That looks pretty quiet. Qatar looks quiet. But I would say that about any country with just a great deal of caution that tomorrow it might look different.
So to some extent, it's a ferment not just of peoples, but also of ideas. And you've already mentioned a few ideas that are falling by the wayside. Gaddafi and his pan-Arabism first, and then his pan-Africanism that seems clearly to be on the way out. Perhaps the death of Osama bin Laden signals the decline of Wahhabism as an idea. Which would be potentially very constructive. What are the ideas in the region that you see potentially winning, and the ideas that we should anticipate further losing ground?
Well, I think the ideas that are winning are ideas about dignity, freedom, people being able to live their own lives. Certainly ideas about corruption and the just absolutely absurd levels of corruption that have taken place. So I think those are very positive ideas. But I would add one thing, and that is these movements are not anti the West or anti-US. On the contrary, they are very pro-Western. And I think as we think of our response, we've got to bear that reality in mind.
Is it possible in your mind that at some level George Bush and the neoconservatives were right? That if you forcibly attempt to transplant democracy in the Middle East, it'll eventually take root?
No. I mean, I would have difficulty saying yes, even if I really thought the argument was right. But I think the answer is no, because it's not being forcibly. It's coming from the bottom up. It is truly coming from the bottom up. And I think the most important thing that the U.S. can do is to be hands-off in Syria. Just let it play out. Hands off in Yemen. That's tough because of al-Qaeda being there, but you don't want to get more engaged. I think with what we're doing in Libya is right, but that's enough.
Probably we have no choice but to be hands off in Syria, because it's actually hard to imagine what we could possibly do to have a positive effect. But as you said, one of the ideas that seems to be catching on is responsibility to protect.
Yes.
So in principle, that could be a problem to the extent that it will require us to be drawn in more readily. It will make us more susceptible to calls.
We're creating precedents.
Right.
Yes.
Do you worry about that anywhere in particular? Does it mean we'll be even more stuck in Afghanistan than we have been for the last decade?
We knew this when responsibility to protect as a doctrine was developed. I mean, there's no way it could be applied everywhere all at the same time. It's going to take a long time. Precedents will be created, and people will do a dance to say that isn't a precedent for something else that they don't want to do. We're into a period of enormous change, and I think it's basically positive, but it has risks. It has real risks, but it's basically very positive, and we should see it that way to be on the right side of history.
I like the optimistic note myself, and with that, I'd like to thank you very much for coming in today and spending some time with us. I hope we can follow up, perhaps not too long into the future, because obviously, of course, there's much more to say, and things change very rapidly in that part of the world. So thank you again. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. Please look for our complete collection of Inside the Issues CIGI online video podcasts. at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.
These are quasi-independent organizations. But Osama bin Laden has been the big name, and he has had almost a cult following, I would say, and he's gone, buried at sea.
But a lot of people had thought that he was dead already. There have been many reports of his death, and he's had long periods of silence where people thought perhaps he was ill, or he had died, or been killed, or something, and we weren't quite sure. So it's a bit surprising to think that now that we're highly confident that we found him and he was killed, that it makes some kind of big difference. Is it more than an emotional difference, more than an optics difference?
I think it is an emotional.
This week on Inside the Issues, I talk with Gordon Smith on the death of Osama bin Laden. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, the CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And every week I talk to a noted expert in global
Emotional difference, but probably on both sides. One, after all this effort and the ongoing war in Afghanistan and the activities of the U.S. and the Pakistanis in Pakistan, this was all designed to get at the source of Al-Qaeda. And the founder is Osama bin Laden. Now, once he's gone, as I said a moment ago, it doesn't mean the problem has gone away, not at all. But that leader, the spiritual leader, if I can call it that, for Al-Qaeda is gone, and I think that's important. I think it's going to aggravate his followers, probably prompt them to do something somewhere, or at least try.
Governance here from the studios at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario. And this week I'm pleased to welcome Gordon Smith, a CIGI Distinguished Fellow, as well as the Executive Director of the Center for Global Studies at the University of Victoria, and in previous life, of course, a distinguished public servant, a Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador to NATO, and Canada's G7, G8 Sherpa for Prime Minister Chrétien. So,
that's right.
Great deal of experience in and outside of government to draw upon today as we reflect on the very intriguing recent news about the targeted hit, I suppose we should say, of Osama bin Laden and what that means for the region, for the world, and for Canada as well. Yeah. So if it's all right with you, we'll start right off, and let me ask you the obvious question. Just how big news is this, the death of Osama bin Laden? Is this as big as the world is making it out to be at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's really big news. It's big news because it hadn't been done before. I mean, this is 10 years later. So I think it's big news, the fact that he is gone. Does this mean that Al-Qaeda will disappear? No, I don't think so at all. Indeed, I think there could well be heightened Al-Qaeda activity over the next few months. But the fact, because it's a franchised organization, as we all know, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula.